describe what it went from and what it seems to be going to the best of your ability.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, like you could say there is a world of difference between a Dan Peterson and a Spencer Fluhman, like personality-wise approach. Well, I feel like you've done this very thoroughly, but a more okay. The traditional apologists were much more literalistic in what they were trying to defend. Like the Book of Mormon is literally like historical, what it claims to be, that sort of a thing. And for that reason, because they put it in an ancient setting, they have to be trained in ancient languages. And as far as I'm concerned, as far as the traditional apologists go and their education, I mean, these people are trained in places like Hebrew University, and they, do work in Egypt, and they also study in like European. I mean, I feel like in a lot of ways, they are much better trained as scholars. They work in multiple languages. They do, various historical periods across different cultures and countries. They're very, but something that they're not hip to, I guess, is the development of postmodern literary theory that, really started taking over humanities departments, in the late 60s and 70s, and even continuing to this present day. And also, they don't care about, the traditional apologists don't care about, like, in their scholarship at least, they don't care about social justice. Like, that's just not something they're preoccupied with, which I don't particularly fault them for. And so they're a lot more antagonistic, combative. They are willing to call a spade, I guess. It's just a different type of scholarly culture. Whereas the more...
And they're trying to kind of, if not prove the church is true through science or whatever their discipline is, they're at least trying to erect as many plausible, opportunities for plausible deniability so that you could still leave open the possibility for belief.
Yeah,
from a archaeological, anthropological, linguistic standpoint. Is that not fair? Or?
I think that's probably pretty fair. I think
it's the old way.
And I think it's very important to say that they are not, trying to prove the church is true. Like, they are not trying to do that. What they're trying to do is
prove that it's not false.
That's right. When other people come up with arguments, whether they're ex-Mormons or evangelicals or secular thinkers or whatever, whenever those people come up with arguments that make the church look false, they are primarily preoccupied with dismantling those arguments. So I think that's an important distinction.
It's defense.
And it's a type of defense that can feel very offensive, right? But that's what they would. Yeah, I think so. Now but it's combative. I think that's the important part. Now these kind of calling it traditional versus new also mars the historical record a bit, and anybody who wants to understand better how these things came to be, and we can get into it, but I don't know if it's too technical for this podcast, but John Charles Duffy wrote a great master's thesis about the development of Mormon apologetics that I think is really helpful. But one thing that he points out, which is really helpful for me, and this point will be relevant in a minute, is that what we call, quote, traditional apologetics and what we call, maybe neo or new apologetics really came out of the same, intellectual contingent and defeated the other three combatants, whether it was the anti-modernists or the kind of the historical naturalists, like someone like Mike Quinn or Leonard Arrington or something like that. And to get this full picture, I think John Charles Duffy, his MA thesis is very clarifying. And so for me, let me describe first what the new apologists are like, and then let me take a step back and compare them from my perspective. The neo-apologists are much more, how do I put it? Okay, well, almost all of them are Americanists. Almost all of them specialize in the modern world. Almost all of them really only work comfortably in English as far as their scholarship goes. Almost all of them focus on a particular country, usually their own, and that's why I say Americanist. They are sensitive to social justice issues or identity politics or they're very they tend to be well read in a lot more postmodern theory. But here's the weird thing I have to say real quick, is that the, quote, traditional apologist, if you include somebody like Lou Midgley in that, which I would, back in like the late 70s or so, he was using postmodern theory to say the anti-modernists, people like Hiram Andrus or Bob Millett at the time, or Joseph McConkie or whoever, like they were backwards, right? And so even the traditional apologist had a strain of this postmodernism, like kind of back in the day. But now, I think it almost feels like you can't even go to like a discussion about Mormonism with these more kind of liberal-minded folks without having read like Foucault or Baudrillard or Bataille or Derrida or Lacan or Kristeva or
and give us the 2-minute
Agamben
primer. Give us the 2-minute primer on postmodernism. And,
oh, gall, really?
No, I mean, just what's the basic approach?
Okay, the number one thing, the first rule about
it's gotta
postmodernism.
Include something about words not meaning what that you think they mean. That's got. I just know that at the end that's something that you're going to say.
Yeah. Well,
words don't mean what we think they mean.
The first rule of postmodernism is don't talk about postmodernism. Okay. So, and postmodernism is by no means a homogenous school of thought. When you have thinkers as different as like Deleuze or but they also use other thinkers, German thinkers like Heidegger, or they'll go back to Husserl, or, and this, I should specify, I am not an expert in any of this stuff. It just gets splashed in my face as I take literature classes, when what I'd rather be doing is reading poetry and literature. I know this sounds bizarre, and so you almost like have to become somewhat conversant in it to even speak the lingo. It's sort of like, how there's legalese, right?
Sure.
It's like there's academies, and in the humanities nowadays, the overwhelming language of academies is postmodern thinkers, book titles, buzzwords, stuff like that. And so, but yeah, I think that whether or not it's primary value or concept or whatever, I think the idea that words don't really mean what you think they mean is pretty common theme. And so that's how you're actually able to use, in kind of like a more liberal apologetics, the idea like, didn't at Utah State, they had that whole day discussion about Joseph Smith and translation? You're able to have an entire day where nobody cares what translation actually means. Translation can mean like a lot of things except for whatever it is you think it means.
Yeah, because
right?
Wasn't it pretty clear what Joseph Smith thought or said he was doing, and what everyone around him, heard him say, right?
Well, I'll put it this way. That was the impression I had growing up, that there were plates in a different language. Joseph Smith used the power of God to make it available in English, whatever was written on those plates.
But to translate is what we were all
told.
I
mean, that's how I understood it. And this is why kind of the more traditional apologetics, they really care about what words actually mean. They're philologists, right? They're lovers of language and words and things like this. They really care what words mean, and so they spend tons of time in dictionaries and and just trying to parse the fine meaning of words, whether it's some Hebrew syllable or whatever else. They really care about that because they believe that words have meaning. But so they read texts very closely. I sometimes, whereas I feel like the new style is more interested in kind of like broad gestures about like, it's not as concerned with the particularities of the historical meanings of a word or something and how that might be relevant and whatnot. And so they'll talk about how something is bold or something is a wager or something is like, and to me, this is all a little dramatic, like it's like, well, I mean, if you feel like this is a bold move, then get some excitement in your life. That's how I feel a lot of times. But
so give an example of what they might call bold or exciting or creative.
So Richard Bushman, there was a symposium, 1 or 2 days. I think the Maxwell Institute actually did sponsor this a year or two ago. And like all these scholars came, both Mormons and non-Mormons, and they gave a talk on what they're good at, whether it's philosophy or literature, history or whatever else. And then, but they also were connected to Richard Bushman in some way, because Richard Bushman has been like overwhelmingly influential on this group of thinkers. I mean, you can't overstate it. Like what Hugh Nibley is for the traditional apologist, that's what Richard Bushman is for this group over here. Like it is really that strong of an influence.
Let me pause you for a second. Yeah. So we have a listener, Eric, says, this is all really fascinating, but it's starting to get confusing.
Okay.
I'm not really following a line of thought. I know that, and fair. Someone else joked, haha, like 2 minutes, it took me an entire year to kind of understand postmodern theory.
Right, yeah.
But
it's like we could be in this quagmire for a while.
But I think there's a way to, I mean, we've kind of touched on it, but isn't it sort of just saying everything has a context, words don't have inherent meaning, everything that we do, can you fill in the gaps of just sort of what a postmodern approach would sort of be towards religion and scripture and faith versus a more literalistic, relying on science and evidence approach?
Well, postmodernism is obsessed with power, and there's not actually like positive qualities known as truth or goodness or beauty or something like that.
So there is no truth.
They're not positive qualities. So truth does exist as a manifestation of like social or institutional arrangements. Like,
but this truth of like, the church is true, or the scriptures are true, or postmodernism would say what? No.
Well, like Adam Miller said on some podcast, I'd have to find it. I think they were pitching his book, Future Mormonism or something. And he said, for Joseph Smith's day, it made a lot of sense to ask the question, which church is true? But for us today, that's not a very valuable question. So let's not focus on it, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I even wrote this in that original essay I did on how to stay in the church after a crisis of faith. Would you ever call a ham sandwich true, right?
Yeah, okay.
So what's the value of calling a church true, Book of Mormon true?
Yeah.
And this is something Dan Witherspoon was talking to me about as recently as yesterday. Just this basic idea that forget about truthfulness. And this even Bushman said, if you listen to my interview of Bushman way back in the day, he said, I don't like to, and this is just me paraphrasing.
Yeah.
You may have transcribed these words recently, but I remember something to the effect of, I don't think of my testimony in terms of truthfulness. My testimony of the church is rooted in its goodness, right?
Yeah, but okay. And this happens all the time, right? If somebody says that they believe the church because it's true, and you say, well, what about X, Y, or Z? Then they'll say, well, I don't believe in it because it's true, but because it's good. And then you say, well, what about X, Y, or Z? And they say, well, I don't believe in it because it's good, but I believe in it because it's true, whether I like it or not. And it's just like, okay, I'm bored with this,
Right, but it binds. It's a binding force for many people's lives.
Yeah,
so
sure. Well, because it creates. So I think cognitive dissonance is possible in part, not because you have this thing over here and this other thing over here that conflict and their intention. It's like you're not dealing with both of them at the same time, right? It's like you can deal with this issue in one season of your life, and you come around to this issue in another season of your life. But the primary responsibility I see of what I call like a liberal apologetics is to sort of like displace this stuff, to not let it concentrate and focus in a moment of crisis. That it's just to kind of like keep it over. And actually, like, is her name Laura Hales?
Yes.
Right? So she was explicit about this. When I went to the Association of Mormon Letters last year, I presented on poetry, and she was on the same panel, and she was presenting on writing and rhetoric and things like that. And I think she was also the editor of a recent collection of essays, apologetic essays. And she said, like, it's literally like it is our job as like liberal members of the church to help our more conservative brothers and sisters come to our point of view, to kind of like bury something which is shocking or upsetting in all this other prose. And she said, the idea is build the bomb shelter before you drop the bomb. Right. And that's the idea. But to me, I'm like, I don't like, I can understand if you take in too much information too quickly, that can just like shatter your life and that can create a lot of problems. But I didn't feel like what Laura was saying was coming from a place of concern for people's individual well-being. I think she was coming from a place of concern that they keep their faith intact.
Right. It's sort of like what seems to be underpinning it all is that there's this authority structure that collects money and demands things of people.
Don't look at that. Don't look at
their
this.
Time and their money. I mean, that's the fact.
Don't look at this.
That's the corporation. That's the tithing. That's the money. That's the apostles. That's the general authorities. That's the patriarchy. And then what postmodern sort of neo-apologetics wants to do is, instead of having this wall where if I punch the wall, it breaks my hand because it's too hard. Words, if they actually mean something, well, that can hurt. And if some things can be really true or false, then when the fist meets the wall, the fist can break.
Yeah.
So instead, postmodernism wants to turn this wall into a waterbed, a water balloon, where if you punch it with evidence or truth, or even an expectation of truth, it's like, true, what is true? And translation, what is translation? It's all murky. It's all has a context. And so it's trying to sort of make the target as nimble and as flexible and as mushy as possible, so that nothing ever gets broken standing up against it, or when confronted with it.
And I can have like a couple quick anecdotes about this. So, and when I say somebody's name, like I just mentioned Laura's name, I'm not saying it because she and I had a private communication or something like that. It was like, you're literally presenting at a conference. Like, if I can't talk about this, I don't know what to say. And the other thing the Maxwell Institute does, at least used to, it's been a while since I've attended, they have like a brown bag lunch where once a week, they'll come, they might have a speaker, they might have a piece of literature they want to discuss or whatever. And so one week they were discussing an essay by Rosalind Welch in the Mormon Studies Review about Mormonism and what she calls materialism or something like that. And this is a very relevant discussion for her, for Joe Spencer, and for Adam Miller, but it's also relevant, oddly enough, for Ralph Hancock, who critiques it and doesn't like it. And for those who don't know, Ralph Hancock is a right-wing conservative political thinker, I think very influenced by Leo Strauss, and he's political science, right, at BYU, as far as I understand. And so here we are in a room, there's like 15 of us, probably, and Ralph is trying to say, like, what you just said. Like, there are rules, and if you violate those rules, there are consequences. He was speaking specifically about the authority structure of the church. And I got the feeling that everyone else in the room was just like, I don't really know, It's more of like I like the waterbed image, And so I honestly agreed with Ralph. It's just that Ralph thinks it's a good thing, and I think it's a terrible thing, But I think that he's describing it accurately. And so I was trying to push on this, and people were saying, well, yeah, you might get shocked or punished or something like that. But the rules are always moving. They're always shifting. You never really know where they are. There's nothing really hard line. And, I don't particularly want to call this individual out, but somebody who was saying this, and I disagreed completely. But I was like, okay, well, your last book that you wrote, you told me that 200 people bought the copy, and you know, obviously this is something you care about. Did you ever think to send it up to general authorities at Salt Lake? Like, this might be some good advice. And as far as I know, I haven't read the book, but as far as I know, he probably does have some good advice. And just the response, I was just like, exactly. He said, I haven't sent it because that's not how things work. And I'm like, yeah. No, duh. Like, there are rules.
Yeah. And this goes back to why we wanted to interview the Millers, Brooke and Josh Miller, why we feel like it's important to talk about Spencer Flume and the Maxwell Institute and Neo-Apologetics. And we're going to get to your critiques, but I just want to give a foundational critique, which is this, that when Joseph Smith, claims to start the church, he's telling people, real plates were delivered by an angel. I translated those plates into English. This is a real civilization. He's pointing at Native Americans, calling them Lamanites.
That's true. Yeah.
People are joining the church because in D&C 1, it says the only true church on the face of the earth with which God is pleased. And so people are joining the literal one true church with literal authority from God, with a literal historical Book of Mormon, with literal plates. And that's why they're joining it. And that's why they're giving their lives to it, because it literally is solid and it's true. And, I was always taught growing up that the gospel is plain and precious. Plain meaning it's simple, and precious meaning that it's very valuable. And it's valuable because it's the only way to the celestial kingdom. And so when you look at our history of people sacrificing and literally bleeding and dying and giving money and time and their children and their lives to the church, it's because it's literally true. It's because the scriptures are literally true. They are translations, and Joseph was a prophet and a seer and a revelator. And when the prophet speaks, he's speaking for God, and that's the whole value proposition. And so that's the foundation of why then and today so many people remain Mormons. And when the missionaries are going out and preaching this stuff to investigators, this is the message they're giving, not what is truth. We don't even know. What's translation? Who knows what that is? They're giving that a formal narrative, and people are basing their lives, their money, their time, their children, their decisions on education, who to marry, when to marry, all on this assumption, not that it's good and there's value there, and it's because it's true. And so that's I think where the problems really, really begin, is if all that narrative is actually not legitimate or valid, or what people are basing the gospel on, then all of a sudden there's been a bait and switch.
Yeah, definitely.
Right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And a bait and switch of very significant consequence, because I can bet there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Mormons that would make very different decisions if they knew the evidence and the truth, and that the narrative was being changed. And then to conclude,
that's right, all
the official conference talks given at General Conference support the literal founding narrative.
Yeah. Unless some individual pressures a general authority, then that general authority will respond in one of two ways. They'll say, well, I have authority over you, and this is the truth. Like Bednar says, I am Scripture. Or they'll respond by saying, we'll go talk to these really nice scholarly people who are versed in all of these complexities, and hopefully they can help you. It's like, I don't find either of those particularly compelling myself. I think scholars ought to be taken seriously. I think they should be looked into. I don't think they should be written off. But something that one literary critic said that I really appreciated, it's like, if you need to be open to try something, you reserve the right to, get rid of the stuff that doesn't give you nutrients, if you follow what I'm saying. And so there's no reason why anybody who reads a book, whether it's by John Gee or Spencer Fluman, can't come away with that and say, I don't agree, and to have their reasons for not doing so, Yeah.
So what we want to kind of advance to is your critique of neo-apologetics.
Yeah.
I will, but let's read some comments and kind of wrap up this first or second segment with just a few comments or questions from the listeners. I want to invite listeners who are currently listening to write any comments or questions, and I'll ask them. There's been a few. David writes, this neo-apologetic argument breaks down real quick for me. Every Mormon prophet since its inception has made the claim that this is the only true church or God on the earth. This word mastering just does not make sense in the Mormon world.
Word mastering?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What, do you have a response to David?
Well, I agree with him.
What does he mean by word mastering?
Oh, I don't know. You'd have to ask him.
Okay.
But if it means like, why, if God wants me to, okay, first off, God's like one church or whatever is pretty ineffective at actually converting people when you look at the overall human population. But then if you add on top of that in order to really, quote, get it, you have to study all of these arcane things, whether it's the traditional apologetic kind of philological track or the neo-apologetic postmodern post-structuralist track. It's like, I have better things to do with my time, I think a lot of people would say.
But isn't that the secret sauce to people's level of commitment to Mormonism is that they believe it's the true church. It certainly was for me.
Yeah, that mattered for me. And I actually remember working through these problems because I never lived in the, quote, traditional apologetics world. I read their books, but I never went to the fair conference or, followed Interpreter closely or anything like that. I lived in the liberal apologetics world. And I felt like once people start talking about how the church isn't really like the true church, I'm like, what the hell am I doing then? Why was I a missionary trying to get the word out? And I would read statements from people like John Taylor saying, you will be held responsible not only for the people that you convert, but and taking care of them, but for all the people you would have converted if you lived up to your duties and responsibilities. I remember pulling that off a member's, I think it was in a Neil A. Maxwell book, off of a member's shelf in Poland, and feeling like super stressed about that. I was like, I better get to work, and actually, but I will say it is the secret sauce because I've studied a lot of different languages. I'm bad at all of them. But the one that I studied the most effectively, hands down, was Polish. Because when I studied Polish, I was like, people's literal salvation is on the line. And so I was from that perspective, like a religious fundamentalist, right? You have to hear my words or you'll be damned, whether you get the soft damnation that eternal just is God's name or the hard damnation of outer darkness or whatever. But to me, it mattered. The stakes were high and they were real. And for that reason, I had a moral obligation to become as good at Polish as I possibly could. And people in my mission will say that I was good at Polish, but I wasn't just because of some vague scholarly interest. It's no, I have an existential commitment to this. But when you kind of take that out, you're kind of like, why do I care? And this is actually, because I stopped going to church maybe a year or so ago, and a lot of my critiques I feel have really dulled just in that 12-month period, because there was a time when I was very sharp. I could refer to this or that publication, this name, paraphrase the verbiage pretty well. But I feel like now it's kind of becoming, it's I'm getting on with my life, I don't really care.
But the stakes are high for those in it.
Absolutely. Yeah, they were for me.
Yeah.
Very high.
So, I think it really does matter. Let's see. Rick writes, Jackson Washburn, are you listening? Obviously, Jackson is a young pre-mission neo-apologist that many people feel strongly about. I think he's a lovely kid, really smart, precocious. Yeah. But we got a shout out to him. Colin writes, to ease the cog dis, apologists will challenge the very construct of reality.
That's right, yeah.
In order to justify their bias.
Yeah, well, you can call it bias, I guess. But yeah, they will. They will say, and this is, there's a term for this. I think the feminists were the ones who coined it brilliantly. So it was called gaslighting, right? It's where you get somebody to question their own sense of reality so that then they will trust your sense of reality. And you use that as an advantage. Whether you personally advantage from that is not, I think traditionally that's what the term means. But if an institution gains the advantage from that, I think that's also important to note. Yeah.
That was beautiful. I love that description of gaslighting. Yeah. Thank you. Jake writes, postmodernism, quote, all that exists is the text. That's Derrida.
Something like that,
He says, since literature can be interpreted in an infinite number of ways, reality being much more complex than reality can also be interpreted in an infinite number of ways. Do you get what he's saying there?
Yeah, I get what he's saying. I don't know if that's what Derrida says, but I think what he's pointing out is, a fair observation.
That you can always interpret text in a million different ways.
Yeah.
So we can't ever take any word too seriously.
Yeah, and so what they say though, this is the effect or the impact anyway, is because you can do it in any number of ways, what it boils down to is who's the strongest. Who's the most charismatic, who's the most institutionally empowered, and their way matters most. And in a way, there's some truth to that. Why should an apologist who has zero institutional standing, but has put just as much work into something, be taken less seriously than somebody who has done the same amount of work, but they just happen to have the certain credentials or position or friends and network? I mean, like, it's a good question, I feel.
Yeah.
You know?
I feel like the value of religion is that it provides, at its best, in many instances, it just provides solid answers to many of the vexing questions of life about meaning and purpose and identity and morality and spirituality and truth and the afterlife. And so when it's true, or if it's true, then it's great that it provides that solace and comfort. But if it's not true, and if it's just misleading people or deceiving people, then it could appear as taking advantage of people's vulnerabilities and giving them false hope and filling up their lives and taking their money for sort of through deception, if it's not true.
Yeah,
right?
And if I could say, I don't particularly mind if somebody is deluded or wrong about something, because I know that I am. About many things, or even if they have to put their faith in something because they haven't been able to investigate it more thoroughly. That doesn't matter to me especially. What matters to me, if that is going on and they are suffering because of it, and instead of somebody coming along to help them work through that suffering or to become more understanding, they compound the maybe a false sense of reality or something like that, which in turn compounds their suffering. Like, that's what I have a problem with, right? And that happens, I feel like, in the church a lot. So
if a woman is struggling with her role as a woman defined by the church, or a gay person is struggling with being gay, and or someone's the church isn't working for them, they're feeling so much sexual shame or whatever, and then apologists come to try and say, hey, there's still a way for you to stay in. Let's redefine words so that you can stay in a system that is possibly harming you.
Yeah,
is that an example?
Yeah. And I'll use an example from my own time, like from my personal life. I remember my wife looking into the ERA stuff and feeling frustrated, and frankly, a lot of her professors, her female professors and feminist colleagues and stuff, are frustrated. And I was like, yeah, that is weird, because what's wrong with ERA? That seems like a good thing, right? And I'm basing this not on my own opinion, but what I read in the Book of Mormon, right? Neither black nor white, neither male nor female, neither free nor slave, whatever. And so I look into it, and I find a little paragraph from Spencer Kimball where he says, like, he like prophesies, basically, if you want to call it that. And he says, if this were to pass, like bad things would happen, sort of like the family proclamation of the world, what it says. And when I read that, I said, well, Charlie, my wife, I was like, the prophet said this, and the question is, do we trust him or not? At the time I did, now I don't. Yeah. So I was, quote, guilty of this as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to hold questions and comments till the end in our discussion of your critique of neo-apologetics. I want to get back to your story. So anything else you experienced at the Maxwell Institute that's worth mentioning before we talk about your change of faith?
Okay.
And then your critique that led to your critique of neo-apologetics. Okay.
So I was hired in December of 2012, I believe. I did my work, just kind of did it. And then August of 13, I remember there was an Institute retreat. And we went as Institute employees and rafted down the Provo River. And it was a lot of fun. And I remember talking to Blair and to Morgan and to Carl and to all of these guys and feeling this weight lifted off of me that I didn't even know was there. And I felt like here, like I felt like these are my people, like these are people who have a lot of the same values, a lot of the same assumptions about like how the gospel ought to be lived or what it is, or how we deal with problems when we encounter them. And I just felt like I didn't realize that I was carrying that weight and that I felt a little bit lonesome. But when I went on that retreat with them, and there were also female employees as well, but not in research positions. They were office staff or something like that. But, I was on friendly terms with them as well. And but it was the same thing. Like I was like, this is good, you know? And so I myself, when, I don't know, some months after that, I was living in Taylorsville, and my elders quorum president shows me the CES-letter, and I'm reading it. And at the time, you know, I've since spoken with Jeremy and I quite like him. At the time, I kind of laughed at it. Not because I thought it was unfair or ridiculous, but I laughed at the idea that somebody would take something as serious as their commitment to an institution they considered, like, quote, the one true church, or to their salvation or whatever, and that they would read a 80 or 90 page document and feel like, well, I'm out. Like, I was laughing, like, because that didn't compute to me. I was like, if this is serious, you need to take time. And then I learned in retrospect that most people who read the CES-letter really do take that time. They just refer to the CES-letter as a shorthand for all the research that they really do. And so I was laughing a bit at like at a ghost that doesn't really exist. Anyway,
So you were mad at Jeremy, or you were frustrated at Jeremy for writing it?
I wasn't frustrated at him for writing it because I felt like people can write what they want. I was frustrated that it seemed to generate a response, my understanding, that people would, like, on Friday be active Latter-day Saints and on Monday be ex-Mormons. Like, that didn't make sense to me. Now, whether that happened or not, I don't know.
Happens all the time.
Oh, it does? Okay.
4 hours, you know, 30 minutes, CES-letter can take people out of Mormonism.
Yeah. Well, and just from my temperament, because I really enjoy reading and everything like that, I and looking into things and knowing it for myself, I did not appreciate that approach. I knew I couldn't take that approach, but in retrospect, I'd no longer judge people who have that experience. I think that's totally fine and legitimate, and yeah. So.
Okay, so was that a crack in your shelf then, the CES-letter?
The CES-letter, I thought there were some weird things that I hadn't heard of before that I was like, oh, okay, you know, I should maybe think about that. But really, I was more concerned about my elders quorum president at the time, you know, because the way I felt was, look, I've had a great experience in the church. I have benefited hugely from it. And I don't want there to be something in the way of somebody experiencing enjoyment and everything like that, because there is a document which is not very thorough, that could, you know, instead of being a conversation ender, it could be a conversation starter, is kind of how I felt, right? And so, but, you know, I didn't know this at the time, I don't think, but looking back, my same friend, this elders quorum president, I think was far more disturbed about the premature death of his father and the impact that on his faith. And then, like, when reading the CES-letter, it almost was just like that was the match that lit the dry grass, I feel.
In my work with people who lose their faith, there's usually, we talk about the rider and the elephant with Jonathan Haidt from The Righteous Mind. Usually the elephant represents your emotional mind, your emotional self, and the rider on top of the elephant represents your logical brain. And I've found that most people experience a deep emotional shift that starts leading them out of the church. And then the evidence that becomes available, like the CES-letter or Mormon Stories or whatever, becomes the reasoning by which they justify their shift. So in many instances, we use evidence to justify the positions we arrive at emotionally.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would also say in my own life, that was my experience. So, and I bring that anecdote up because you asked me about the Maxwell Institute, and I was working there at the time, and in the CES-letter, Jeremy says some things about the Maxwell Institute that I felt did not accurately portray what it is we were doing. Because, like, you know, most people understand, they see it primarily as an apologetics institution or something like that. And it has that element, but I said to him, it's kind of like you go to IKEA and they sell meatballs, but it would be absurd to refer to it as a meatball factory, right? I mean, it's like a furniture store. And to my mind, the Maxwell Institute was a scholarship house. And so I you know, corresponded with him a little bit in August of 2014 about that, and you know, had some back and forth, and I thought I was kind of, you know, doing the good thing or whatever, but I don't know, whatever.
So what happened? What happened in your... Oh, one quick question.
Yeah.
So when you think about some of these career apologists like Daniel Peterson or Louis Midgley, and I know they have other careers, but let's face it, that's a big part of what they do in life.
Yeah.
Or even people like Bushman or Givens, where maybe they're retired and they didn't always draw a significant portion of their income from being apologists. But now they get fame or reputation or popularity or attention from their apologetics.
Yeah.
Can you say whether your employment with the Maxwell Institute, served as a binding force for your defense of the church? I mean, it's pretty logical that if you're drawing a paycheck, it's gonna buttress your defenses of the church.
Yeah, but I hope it can also be said that is true. But I hope it can also be said that I wasn't doing it because of that, right? Like,
as an influencer.
Yeah. How could it not be?
Okay.
Yeah.
So what happened in your own faith journey?
So I leave to Toronto, fall of 2015, start my PhD program. First year goes by, I don't think with any problems. I was just an early morning seminary teacher. I dug it, it was fun. And it's a cool church environment. Most places, like here in Utah, it's very uniform culturally, whether socioeconomically or racially or, just aesthetically or whatever. But in Toronto, they have over 130 different nationalities represented. I think Canadian whites are in a minority. Like the stake president was Finnish, my bishop was Chinese, his counselors were Filipino and Cuban, and the Cuban guy had a Hungarian wife. I mean, it's cool, to experience that. And Toronto is just like that everywhere you go. I mean, like there was I think my bank teller my first week was a guy named Vladimir Velasquez or something like that. He's got Russian on one side, but Latino on the other. And so yeah, that was pretty good. And then it was the summer of 16, about a year and a half ago, that I went to BYU for a 3-week summer seminar. And this was not the Bushman Givens seminar, which is housed at the Maxwell Institute. This was Jim Faulkner, who's a philosopher there. It's with the Wheatley Institution, which I don't know too much about it, but my understanding...
Evangelical Christian, right?
No.
Okay.
Wait.
The Wheatley?
My understanding is that the Wheatley Institution sees itself as what the Hoover Institute is for Stanford. The Wheatley Institute wants to be for BYU, kind of like a right-wing conservative think tank, sort of a thing. And there was probably 10 or 12 of us in that seminar. It was a blast. I'm still friends with a lot of people in there. Well, I'm on friendly terms with all of them, I believe. And people from Europe, or one guy was Haitian, or it was a cool experience. But a couple friends, this is going to sound really silly maybe, but a couple friends really recommended to me that show True Detective. Do you know this?
No.
I think it was HBO. First season was with Matthew McConaughey, and I can't believe I'm forgetting his name because I love him so much.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, sorry.
Faith crisis.
Yeah, sorry. But it's about like satanic ritual abuse.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Thanks for clipping me along, by the way. I have that disease that academics suffer from.
It's fun.
I'm happy. Do that at any time. And so my wife and we watch it and thought it was really good. And then we see a friend of ours that my wife did her master's with. And we couldn't believe we ran into this friend because, first off, she doesn't live in this country. And second off, my wife and I were on a flight from LAX to Provo. And what are the odds of running into our friend that we haven't seen in several years, who's not even in this country? So we said, you got to come over tonight. And she did. And I kind of asked if she was still going to church, just because a lot of my friends weren't. And she said she wasn't. And she said because she grew up in a household that's kind of like a ritual abuse household. And I had never heard of any of this, right? I didn't encounter it in the CES-letter. I didn't see it in, like liberal apologetics, traditional apologetics. I never heard of this. It was a hot topic in the early 90s, and you could even find some things discussed or written about it. And I know that it's very controversial, because didn't Martha Beck talk about this in her book? And like whatever. Yeah. I'm not going to weigh in on any of this.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not
just
going
that there was a time period in the, let's just say 80s, 90s, where it was rumored that satanic ritual abuse was happening with Mormons, by Mormons, some even rumored to be in Mormon temples and Mormon chapels. And some think it's real, some think it's like recovered memory garbage.
Yeah.
And then there's people in between, and
right.
most have never heard of it.
Right. And so I'm not going to make like hard statements about it one way or another, but the way my friend described it, and from what I did study, and then more importantly, once I learned about how the church settles out of court abuse cases, talking with, I think I heard a lot of this stuff from your podcast, like with Matt Long, or later with Natasha Helfer Parker kind of alludes to it a little bit. And you learn a little bit about like how Curtin and McConkie operates, and the non-disclosure agreements and stuff like that. That was my emotional break. That was the elephant.
Why was that so impactful to you?
Well, it was an emotional break for me to learn that not only is abuse taking place, and I'm not talking about like this metaphorical, like, oh, people feel microaggressions or things. I'm talking about like really bad stuff, right? Like, not only is that taking place, and not only does the church know about it, the church is also involved in actively covering it up. And you try to talk about not even just this stuff, not even stuff that's like extreme over here, but you try to talk about kind of some more basic stuff, and you get iced out quick. So it was once I had that emotional break, then I started listening to all the Mormon Stories episodes, which I didn't really wasn't particularly interested in before. Grant Palmer, Brent Metcalf, whoever else. And then I also listened to a lot of John Larson. I listened to some Infants on Thrones because John Hamer is in Toronto and I got to know him there. And then once I was like, okay, now I've got a much more complete view of like what's going on in the church and what is not discussed in the scholarly literature, because scholarly literature does not touch everything. It's not comprehensive as far as topics go, which was my impression before. Then I was like, okay, like no way, I can't do this. And even though the emotional break was that ritual abuse stuff that I heard and learned about, and that's like way out here, what I learned is that this is the limit of acceptability for like, if you work at the Maxwell Institute or whatever, and maybe over here is like traditional apologetics, but then there's like this whole field of stuff that you just cannot talk about. You do not acknowledge publicly or whatever. And they have their little rhetorical strategies.
If you're an apologist, you're saying?
Like if you are a active LDS church scholar who in some way depends on the donor class. Yeah.
So that's Patrick Mason. That's, Kathleen Flake.
Yeah, that's right.
That's Spencer Fluman.
Yeah.
That's Blair Hodges. That's any of those people. And probably Bushman and Givens.
Yeah.
Are
and they depend on it in a yeah. And they depend on it in a different way. So it's not all kind of a uniform fabric. There are different dynamics at play that need to be considered. But generally speaking.
And can you describe some of those areas, some of those third rails, so to speak?
Yeah.
Where you touch it, you get electrocuted?
Yeah. Don't talk about gays. Not in any extensive, meaningful way. And why Greg Prince can do it is because he is an institution unto himself. He's built a lot of wealth, a lot of reputation, a lot of connections over the years, so he can do it. And he also happens to be a straight white dude, so that helps too.
But he has no institutional affiliation. He's not beholden.
That's right.
Like you said, he's not beholden to anyone's money.
Right. But he doesn't get in trouble either.
He can fly himself around. He doesn't have rich people like Terrell Givens or Patrick Mason or Spencer Fluman or Richard Bushman.
Yeah.
he doesn't need rich people to fly him around.
That's right. So he's like kind of separate from the donor class.
And he's also not invited to speak in these firesides.
Yeah.
You know, so in some ways he's made himself persona non grata at that level of neo-apologetic.
I think that's probably fair to say.
He'll present at the Salt Lake County Library, present his research, but I've never heard of a Greg Prince fireside where he's in the Oklahoma City 7 p.m. at night, where liberal or questioning Oklahoma City members are invited to hear Greg talk about this or not. He's excluded from that.
I think that's probably fair to say. And actually, Greg Prince's book was, for me, like the David O. McKay one, very disturbing on a lot of levels. And when I brought it up with somebody who is a BYU professor, he had nothing but contempt for Greg Prince. So I think that's an instance of what you're talking about.
So gays, don't talk about that.
Yeah. Do not talk about, because I was going to say race, but actually it's very chic and vogue to talk about race, but you cannot talk about like how race means that the prophets are full of bunk. Like you cannot talk about that.
Yeah.
Right?
The most sacred thing is the authority the truth claims, the brethren's authority. You don't criticize the brethren.
And the way you do this is like in the race and the priesthood essay is you say, we disavow theories. Well, I learned in my linguistics class, which was taught actually by Dallin Oakes, which is Dallin Oakes' son, that a presupposition is when you state something in such a way that it presupposes a reality. And so if you say, we disavow all theories, now you're presupposing the word all, meaning we're being all inclusive, but also the word theory as if everything stated before this was all at the level of theory, which is not true. And so, you cannot talk about race as far as that. You cannot talk about you can't talk about finance and legality where these things are sketchy and put the church in a bad light. You can talk about it where it's neutral or where it's positive or whatever.
There's no Book of Mormon historicity essay, by the way, so that's certainly got to be.
Oh, is that true?
Are you aware of one?
Well, like I said, I'm kind of, my tools are dulling with time, but so I don't
think
remember.
they ever touched that.
No kidding. Huh. That shocks me. So, now there are things that you can touch if you want to destroy your emotional well-being or your career prospects, like Book of Abraham. Like leave that alone, right? But I don't think the church would get mad at you if you got into that. But for me, for my money, the kernel from which all of these other problems stem is the patriarchal gerontocratic authority. Is do not openly question or defy the power structure. And then I can understand, though, I might have a different opinion if I were composed of different colored skin or biological organs. But my sense is whether it's the gays, the women, the trans, the race, the money, the legality, all of these things is you are questioning the people who are in charge, and you are not allowed to do that. That's my sense anyway.
That's the most sacred cow, is never question the brethren, never challenge their authority.
Right. And so what I've found is that most kind of like generous liberal type folks, when you complain about something that, X, Y, or Z apostle says publicly, they will come back by saying, yes, but I know this person personally. They're very kind. They're very generous. They're very helpful, long-suffering, all of these things. And so for some strange reason, the apostles are like I don't know, Saint Teresa in private, but they're just like terrible, ignorant, bigoted, like jerks in public. I have no idea how this transformation takes place, but that's kind of the idea, right?
Like Daniel Peterson.
Well, it's true. And this is actually true, I think, of most people who are in power that use that power very abusively. They're not there because everybody hates them. Right? Like they're there because they're nice and respectable and
probably charismatic at some level.
And they look after their own and so it's,
and they're probably strategic, diplomatic.
Yeah, but they're not like these like curly-keeled melodramatic villains that are just so obviously evil. Why would anybody take them seriously? It's like, human beings are complex and you kind of need to look at this from a lot of angles.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you now notice that there's there's two narratives, which is the Orthodox traditional literalistic narrative. There's this emerging neo-apologetic, progressive, postmodern narrative,
which has been there for many, many decades, but now
it's becoming the official apologetic.
Yeah, I think it's much more common. Yeah,
it's pastoral in nature.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not relying on ad hominem attacks. It's not trying to use science to defend the church. It's basically relying on postmodernism to say what is truth. It's about goodness. Don't worry about historicity. How boring. Truth is such a boring thing. Evidence is so boring. Let's talk about the ways that it enriches your life.
Yeah.
But then you're also saying there's this huge field of landmines where you're still not allowed to go, not allowed to talk about.
Oh, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a dynamic.
Well, I mean, and then there's some really like mundane stuff, like don't go to Sunstone. If you're like at BYU, right?
Or publish in Dialogue.
Yeah, don't those like these little more mundane things change from year to year, whatever. But another thing is very important is don't validate non-scholars. So if John DeLynn says something, or if Brent Metcalf, or if Jeremy Runnels, or Sandra Tenner, whoever,
non-approved scholars.
Well, they don't even consider
Michael
them
Quinn's
scholars.
A scholar. I have a PhD. Like there are scholars, right? But it's not. It's. Well, go ahead.
Because for them, your credentials as a scholar are as important or more important than your ability as a scholar. So Michael Quinn publishes all his books except one with signature. They go like, don't bother with that, right? So it's kind of like this hierarchy of who you should take seriously. The more grants they get, the more prestigious universities they work at, the more. But the thing that's so laughable about this is they're all publishing, most of them. I think Spencer Fluman's an exception. I think he published with the University of North Carolina, if I remember correctly. But most of them publish their books with Oxford, including things that are just like not very good.
Now, Oxford sounds fancy.
Well, yeah, it is. But any university press is going, look, okay. And this is very complex. We don't have time to get into this. But university presses, for the most part, all work in the red. They don't make money, they lose money. But with the corporatization of the university system since the 1970s, there has been a sense that all of these institutions, their funding needs to be cut unless they are financially self-sustainable. And so all presses, all academic presses have this as a concern and as an anxiety. Now, oddly enough, BYU doesn't. And we could get into that, but it's because it's funded by the church, which is extremely wealthy. And so all academic presses have this problem. So if you tap on a topic or a series or a gold mine that people besides scholars will and university libraries will buy this book, why wouldn't you publish it? Like Oxford publishes, I don't know how many hundreds, if not thousands of scholarly books a year. It's like if they publish 3 or 4 or 5 Mormon books and 1 or 2 or 3 of them are a bit like scholarly shoddy, it's not going to impact their reputation, but it is going to give them increased revenue. And so
you're saying it's not necessarily a prestigious thing to publish with Oxford.
Well, okay. I'm just saying that if it says Oxford University Press on the title, that doesn't necessarily mean the book is substantive.
Right.
Now, there are books that are very good about Mormon topics published with Oxford. So I'm not saying it's a knock against it. I'm just saying it shouldn't give you a green light. However, but in like the scholarly world, like the Mormon liberal scholarly world, if you publish a book with signature versus you publish a book with Oxford, the person who publishes with Oxford is a step up. Like they're more of a scholar or
Shouldn't
whatever.
They be? Is that a fair value?
I disagree.
Why?
I mean, now you want to get into my like personal biases and things like this.
No, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But you think
I don't care. Look, if something, so a monograph, which means a book on a technical topic, I don't care where it's published if it's good.
Okay.
If it's published from Harvard and it's garbage.
Does that happen?
Yes, it happens all the time.
Okay, all right. So just checking.
Yeah. So anyway, and that's the other thing actually that's kind of funny. I should say this is a critique against both liberal kind of faithful Mormon scholarship, but also a critique of ex-Mormon scholarship. They kind of use this idea of peer review as a way of, if I can use this jargony term, fetishizing the quality of work. When peer review is kind of the U.S. academic, it's not equivalent to LDS correlation, but it serves a similar function. It filters out the stuff that is not okay to say. And so that's not all peer review does, but that is something that peer review does. Okay. And if we can move on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but you were just saying about people like Spencer Fluman, they publish in journals. What was your point, that the books they publish are not particularly reputable or not particularly scholarly? Or
we were just talking about things that you can't say, the landmines, right? And one of the landmines is there are certain people you can't take seriously. Paul Toscano, Margaret Toscano, don't even take them seriously, which is laughable, because it's like, who's writing as much theology as Paul Toscano and who's writing as much like Mormon theology and scholarship and things like that, like Margaret Toscano. But, if you're...
And history, Michael Quinn, right? Who's more...
Yeah. And
who's a better Mormon historian?
I as far as somebody who gathers all of the material and tries to look like synoptically at it, I mean, he's very, very good, but that's not, look, in academia, maybe this sounds weird, but the point of history is not to tell what happened. Now, you get good historians like D. Michael Quinn and Don Bradley and people who don't have stellar academic credentials in terms of their positions and grants and so forth, and their chumminess with the donor class, who really, as historians, and they're excellent, just say, I just want to know what happened. But for most people, that's not what, like most historians, that's not what writing history means. For most people, writing history means having a thesis and defending it.
Right.
So it's a different activity.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.